What's up, guys? Welcome back to the MMA meeting. Let's Talk TheWeasle podcast, where we talk all things MMA, and hope you guys are having a great day, man. That last UFC Fight Night card was actually pretty decent. It wasn't too bad. We had some crazy good finishes, some controversy, and overall pretty decent of a Fight Night card. Definitely better than some of the last couple. The highlight of the card was Jim Miller. He's definitely going to be a Hall of Famer, breaking records, knocking out his opponents. I mean, they throw newcomers at this guy and he just sends them back packing. It's actually pretty incredible what he's able to do against the younger competition. Now, these guys are making like their debuts against him for a guy who has over 40 UFC fights, not even just professional. He made his UFC debut in his 12th professional fight. He has 42 inside the octagon, and these guys don't even put up a fight against him. The long-time known submission artist Jim Miller is knocking these guys out, something he really hasn't done too much in his career. He has 7 total knockouts in his entire MMA career, and 3 of those knockouts are in his last 5 fights. But how he did against Jesse Butler was pretty slick. He only pressured Butler when he slipped a punch. So he would slip one of Butler's punches and then try to catch him with the left, and that forced Butler back into the fence. And then Butler tried it again. He threw a straight. Miller got his head on the outside of it and returned with the left hook as Butler was turning to face Jim Miller, which means that his head's going to turn right into Miller's fist, magnifying the damage and knocking him out. That was one of the examples of looping punches beat straight punches, but that only really happens when you're able to avoid the straight punch, which Miller did. He slipped on the outside of it before he beat him with the looping. And now he's looking to go and fight in the UFC 300 card, which would mean that he fought at UFC 100, 200, and 300, and he's won those fights. He won at UFC 100 against Mac Danzig. I remember Mac Danzig, man. That was a long time ago. Brings back memories. And then for UFC 200, he knocked out Takanori Gomi in the first round. So they have to put this guy at UFC 300, and the opponent should be someone a little bit more difficult. Now, I'm not going to say a ranked fighter or something like that, but definitely an older fighter to bring some kind of excitement to it. And if he retires at UFC 300, that would be historic. He is the UFC veteran. Nobody's had more fights than this guy, and he's fought everybody at this point, from Dustin Poirier to Charles Oliveira, to Donald Cerrone, to Beneil Dariush, Michael Chiesa, Diego Sanchez, Anthony Pettis, Dan Hooker, Joe Lozon, Benson Henderson, Gray Maynard. I mean, he's went up against so many great fighters. It would be a shame if he never gets into the Hall of Fame. Rarely do you ever put fighters that were never champions in the Hall of Fame, but he definitely deserves it more than pretty much anybody else who hasn't won a belt. The other big knockout of the Fight Night card was Jimmy Mullarkey getting knocked out. So he wasn't able to perform the way Jim Miller did. Jimmy Mullarkey went up against Muhammad Naimov, who took the fight on short notice, and he got knocked out. Jim Miller knocked out the guy that showed up on short notice, but Jimmy Mullarkey himself got knocked out. Jimmy Mullarkey was supposed to fight Guram Kutluladze, and see him getting knocked out like that against Naimov, it just tells me what Guram would have done to this guy. Mullarkey made a huge mistake of faking a takedown, and he went so deep with it. You could definitely tell this guy's not a wrestler. Shot in, went way too deep, postured up, and Naimov intercepted him with a right and a left, putting him down. Now, some people say that it was a bad stoppage, it was too early. I don't agree too much with that, because when Naimov was landing ground and pound, Mullarkey was not moving much. It was until the ref pulled Naimov off of him that Mullarkey was getting back to reality. If the ref did not get in there, Naimov would have just continued the ground and pound and just caused unnecessary damage to Mullarkey. You don't want to see that guy go completely out cold like that for the ref to stop it. He wasn't defending himself, he was eating shots, and it was a great performance. Short notice knockout for Muhammad Naimov, and now he's going to stick around. Usually these guys like this who make the UFC debut and they take the fight on short notice, they don't really stick around because they usually lose that fight. But this was a great opportunity, succeeded by Muhammad Naimov, and we're going to see him more often now. And about Guram Kutluladze, so it turned out, this is what I'm hearing, I haven't confirmed it yet, but Guram had visa issues, and that's why he wasn't able to fight, which is very strange because he pulled out like a week before the fight. I'm pretty sure you know if you have visa issues way before that. It is a bit questionable, but they're saying that we should see him very soon. Good thing it wasn't an injury. And speaking of injuries, what about Jared Gordon? You guys see this whole thing around people trying to blame Jared Gordon for having a concussion? No, it's the doctors. How did the doctors miss Jared Gordon having a concussion? This guy got headbutted by Bobby Green a few weeks ago. Definitely got concussed by that. He almost got knocked out by the headbutt itself. He comes back shortly after to fight Jim Miller, and he wasn't medically fit to fight. Of course he wasn't. The doctor should have known this way beforehand. How did he slip by them? Yes, Jared Gordon should be taking care of his own health, but fighters doing anything possible to get by doctors to compete is not a new thing. If these fighters if they could get past the doctors without them knowing, they would fight with one detached limb, which actually we've seen with TJ Dillashaw. TJ Dillashaw came into the fight against Aljamain Sterling with one arm. Michael Bisping got by the doctors with one eye. These fighters are too tough for their own good. People who are blaming Jared Gordon cannot expect him to be like, oh wait, I'm hurt, I'm not going to fight. No, they want to fight. They'll get by the doctors in any means necessary. It's up to the doctors to make sure these guys are okay. Way beforehand. It's crazy, man. It's not strange to see that Jared Gordon wanted to fight while concussed. Another finish on that card though was Karine Silva getting that Achilles lock on Caitlin Souza and tore her knee. You don't see these kind of submissions too often, so Karine Silva took down Caitlin Souza with a belly-to-belly, was in the full guard, and immediately attacked the leg with a submission. When she leaned to her side, that's when the knee got torn. Both recognized it immediately. Obviously, Caitlin Souza felt it, but even Karine Silva was like, yeah, I just destroyed this girl's knee. But good performance for Karine Silva. She was actually supposed to fight Caitlin Vieira, but Caitlin Souza took it on short notice, and this is what I'm talking about. Like, these young fighters who are stepping in on short notice like that, it's tough for them. You have to give them all respect in the world to get in there like that, and it makes Muhammad Naimov's performance so much more spectacular. Alex Caceres looked amazing against Daniel Pineda, just destroying the body, left hooks, left straights to the body, big body kicks, stay in the southpaw stance for the majority of the fight, and Bruce Leroy, another veteran of the game, just performing better than he's ever done before. He's never looked this good. And that's a strange thing because these older fighters usually are much better when they're in like their early 30s. As time is going on, these guys are performing even better in their mid to late 30s. What about Abu Bakar Nurmagomedov slapping Zaleski dos Santos after the third round? I don't know what that was about. He probably thought that when Zaleski threw that knee, that he threw it after the bell, but I don't think he did. That was so dumb from Abu Bakar to do. The fight's over, you lost, don't get upset, don't get frustrated. You performed the best you could, and it wasn't enough to beat Zaleski. Zaleski was the best guy he fought, and it showed where his capabilities are right now. He held up Zaleski against the fence for like half of that fight. You don't win fights like that unless your name is Merab Dvalishvili. And then in the main event, where Amir Albazi defeated Kai Kara-France with that controversial decision, still crazy to think about that Chris Lee gave the fourth round to Albazi. Any other round would at least make more sense than the fourth. The fourth was so one-sided for Kai. I just don't understand that. And just like Adesanya said, some of these judges need to have like an interview afterward to explain the reasoning, and I 100% agree with this. Ever since Cecil Peoples said that Shogun Rua's leg kicks against Lyoto Machida were not scored enough because they quote-unquote cannot finish a fight. That was Cecil Peoples who judged that fight, the first one with Shogun and Lyoto, why he gave it to Lyoto. I am very curious to see what Chris Lee would say for scoring the fourth round for Albazi. But that's nothing against Albazi himself, it's the judges. Albazi at least showed that he is somewhere on the level of the top 5, because this guy went from fighting no top 10 fighters to fighting Kai Kara-France, and he performed pretty well for a guy who's never went up against that level of competition. Both guys really weren't hurting each other to that extent, but at least Amir Albazi was able to put on some of his own punches on Kai Kara-France, who was the striker of the two. But then again, Kai showed great wrestling defense. Both guys showing the evolution in their games to be able to compete in what has seemed like the opposite of their own styles. Kai always was known to be the striker. Amir Albazi always known to be the wrestler. But he does have pretty good power in his hands because look how massive he is for flyweight. This guy's enormous for the weight class. So it's no brainer. If he punches someone with full force, he could hurt anybody in this division. That's why you saw those other knockouts in his career. But more questionable than anything is Albazi being ranked above Brandon Royval. He's right below only Deiveson Figueiredo, Pantoja, and of course Moreno. How is he above Brandon Royval? That doesn't make any sense at all. If you just look off the ranked fighters that these guys beat, Albazi's only ranked win was against Kai Kara-France in a split decision that a lot of people think he lost. Royval also fought Kai Kara-France and submitted him. No split decision, no controversy, submitted Kai Kara-France. He also knocked out Nicolau, who was on a hot streak, submitted Matt Schnell. He did have a split decision win over Bontarine, and he also submitted Tim Elliott. It makes no sense that Albazi's above Royval. I know there is an argument against Royval because, he lost to Brandon Moreno and Pantoja, but those guys are ranked above him regardless. Those are the two best fighters in the weight class other than Deiveson, and Pantoja is fighting Moreno for the belt. Even though Albazi should be in the top 5, of course, being above Royval is not logical, but regardless, I think it sets up a fight between them two. I think Royval versus Albazi should fight each other, and the winner gets a title shot. Now, I do favor Albazi, even though I think Royval should be higher in the rankings right now, just off of what they did, off of merit, the performances of who they beat. Royval definitely should be above Albazi, but I do think Albazi has a good style against Royval. I think he can shut down a lot of the funkiness, a lot of the explosive, crazy, chaotic techniques, take down Royval, control him, possibly even hit him with some big shots on the feet because Royval's defense, not all there. Albazi's not the best striker in the world, but he does have the kind of power to hurt you if you give him that opening. And Royval's going to give him a lot of openings. I honestly think Albazi is one of the tougher matchups for Royval in the whole division. And that possibly could set up the Albazi versus Brandon Moreno or Pantoja, whoever's the champion at the time, set up that fight between them two. Pantoja and Moreno is not a given. A lot of people seem to think that Moreno's too much, but people also forget that Pantoja beat Moreno twice already. No matter how good Moreno gets, the mental aspect of that fight is very, very different. Moreno's never went up against a guy who's 2-0 against him, and that's going to give Pantoja a confidence booster going into that fight against the champion. Then you'll have that triangle matchup MMA math thing where Brandon Moreno proved to be the better fighter against Deiveson Figueiredo. Deiveson Figueiredo proved to be the better fighter against Pantoja, and Pantoja proved to be the better fighter against Brandon Moreno. We have so many examples of the triangle matchups, it's crazy at this point. Now in news, Chris Weidman is coming back. After 3 years from getting his leg broken when he got his leg kick checked by Uriah Hall, the doctors told him that he wasn't going to be able to fight again, but here he is making his return, and they did not give him an easy fight. This guy deserves a tune-up fight. He should not be fighting anyone near the rankings, and he's going up against Brad Tavares. Brad Tavares right now isn't doing the greatest. He's on a 2-loss streak, just got TKO'd by Bruno Silva, and he lost before that to Dricus du Plessis, which in the future could look better if Dricus becomes like a champion one day or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen, but we never know. Well, Brad Tavares has been active and Chris Weidman hasn't. This guy's fought 3-4 times since Weidman got his leg broken. Not going to be an easy fight for Weidman. If he pulls it off against Tavares, that would be insane. But it's going to be tough to watch this one as a Weidman fan. I hope he does well, hope he performs well and is healthy through the whole thing. What about Aiden Ross? I cannot believe I would ever talk about Aiden Ross when it comes to MMA. This guy's like a streamer or something, right? Well, Aiden Ross apparently leaked the Usman and Khamzat fight for October. I don't know if I believe he did it by accident. I mean, a lot of streamers, they do stuff like that for attention, but it's a fight that everybody believes is going to happen in October, right? Khamzat already kind of said it too, right? Khamzat said that he's going to fight Usman, and his next fight's going to be in October, which makes perfect sense as well. Everybody would love to see that. Now, the weight class, we don't know. We don't know if it's going to be 170 or 185 still, but I think Khamzat did say it most likely is going to be 170, but he's up to fight in any weight class. Just very funny that Aiden Ross was in the MMA news. And the next card is going to be pretty interesting. There were some fights that got canceled that were supposed to be very fun. Khalil Roundtree versus Chris Daukaus was the big one. Chris Daukaus is going to make his way down to light heavyweight. That's the weight class for him. And he was supposed to fight Khalil Roundtree. That fight was going to be insane, man. The fight got canceled. Matt Schnell is supposed to fight David Vorak. That was going to be exciting as well. Hakeem Dawadu versus Lucas Almeida was going to be exciting. All three of those fights, which honestly, in my opinion, were the best fights outside of Oliveira versus Dariush on the whole card. Those three, and all of them got canceled. I'm kind of interested on what Mike Malak can do in there. We do have the main event, and Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush is one of the best fights of the year, in my opinion. It's one of the most anticipated for me. I mean, we got one of the biggest stars in MMA right now, Charles Oliveira, against Dariush, who's on a hot streak. We would think that the winner of this would get a title shot, especially if Dariush beats Oliveira. And 100% that fight is going to end in a finish. There's no way. It's very hard to see Oliveira go to a decision. He's only done it once in the lightweight division, and that was against Tony Ferguson. Dariush has a lot of power in his left hand. He's very good on the ground. I just cannot see either Oliveira getting knocked out or Oliveira knocking out or submitting Dariush. I cannot see any other way this fight goes. And then the post-slam is Amanda Nunes versus Irene Aldana, which is actually a fight I'm looking forward to. I am way more excited about this fight than the Juliana Pena fight because Irene Aldana brings a different kind of style. It's new blood for Amanda Nunes, a fantastic boxer for that weight class and getting better in her overall game. If there's any fighter in that division that could put the hands on Nunes and outbox her, it possibly is Irene Aldana. Since Jermaine Durandamy just disappeared off the face of the earth, I don't see any other fighter in the weight class being able to strike with Amanda Nunes besides Aldana. And for sure, Nunes is going to try to get this to the ground and submit her. Chris Curtis is on the card. That's interesting against Imavov. So the card's alright, I guess. Let's see what the future cards are looking like. You do have Marvin Vettori versus Jared Cannonier a week later, with Armin Saryukin versus Joaquim Silva on the card. That's interesting. Armin Petrosian's on it versus Christian Leroy Duncan. Nicholas Dalby versus Musab Salikov's on the card. Harney Barcels versus Miles Johns is a fun one. Bullcut Zalgaz Zumagulov is on the card. Hey man, I think I'm liking this card more than the Nunes and Aldana card. After that, we got Josh Emmett versus Ilya Topuria. That's a main event. That's gonna be crazy, man. Amanda Ribas versus Macy Barber's fun. Punahele Serrano versus Cedricus Dumas. That's a great fight. Gregory Rodriguez is on the card. Bruno Silva versus Brandon Allen. Neil Magny's on the prelims versus Philip Rowe. If Neil Magny's on the prelims these days, you know the card's kind of stacked. Austin Lane versus Justin Tafa is a knockout waiting to happen. David Onama versus Gabriel Santos is crazy. Randy Brown versus Wellington Turman's on the prelims. Tabitha Ritchie, big fan of hers, versus Jillian Robertson's on the card. In the beginning of it all, one of the dark horses of the UFC, Tatsuro Taira, is going to go up against Clayton Rodriguez. This Emmett and Topuria card is stacked, man. This is way better than Nunes versus Aldana. After that, we have the Strickland and Abus Magomedov card. Ariane Lipsky's a fun fighter to watch. Ishmael Bonfim's on the card. If he's on the card, where's his brother? Is his brother here too? Jordan Levitt's on the card? Oh, it's not finished. Okay. They have to have his brother as well, man. Those brothers are savages. And then UFC 290s after with Volkanovski versus Rodriguez and Brandon Moreno versus Alexander Pantoja, with Robert Whitaker versus Dricus Duplessis, Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker, and Bo Nickel versus Trishan. That's a stacked main card. Robbie Lawler versus Nico Price headlining the prelims. Sean Brady versus Jack Della Maddalena, Jasmine Yarogway versus Denise Gomez, Jimmy Cruz versus Alonzo Menafield, Vitor Petrino versus Marcin Prachnio, Christian Rodriguez versus Cameron Simon. Yo, this UFC 290 card is crazy stacked. Yeah, that's a July card. Okay, yeah. But let's go to these questions before I lose track with all these fights. There haven't been a lot of big fights lately, but the biggest one coming up is definitely Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush. And it's not even a championship fight, but it does feel like one. And both guys can win this. This is a very well-made matchup. I think potentially both guys can submit each other. Both guys can knock each other out. Both guys have been knocked out in their careers. So it's not something that's unprecedented. Still crazy to think that Alexander Hernandez knocked out Beneil Dariush in the very first round. That is wild to think about. And now look where Beneil is. And as for Charles Oliveira, I mean, this guy was losing to everybody. And look where he is now. These two guys have shown great perseverance in their careers to progress to the level that they're at, possessing some of the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the whole lightweight division. Both guys have crazy good power, good precision, especially with their left hands. I definitely think that Charles Oliveira is going to have the better jab of the two that could really dictate distance, but looking at how he fought Islam Makhachev, it was a complete opposite of how he should have approached that fight. And hopefully he learns from it and knows how to stick to a better game plan against someone like Beneil Dariush, who's going to be looking to catch him with the left hand. It's not a secret. That left hand from Dariush is the moneymaker. That is the thing that he's going to be looking for to connect on Oliveira's lack of head movement. He's going to hope Oliveira gets aggressive and runs into the left, or he gets aggressive on Oliveira and cuts him off with the left. But the thing that Oliveira tends to do, in the words of Justin Gaethje, create car crashes, and the guy's a glass cannon, so he could get knocked out pretty easily, but he has some lethal hands, man. He has so much confidence in his ability to get the better of an exchange. It's definitely going to make this very interesting. Technically speaking, when we look at the fundamentals, Beneil Dariush is very solid, especially in his defense these days. His boxing offense is pretty one-dimensional. His defense definitely took a major improvement of where it used to be. He blocks a lot better than ever before. He moves his head better than ever before. But if he gets caught leaning back, trying to get away from Oliveira's punches, I can see Oliveira extending his combos, especially that left hook, and cracking Dariush badly. His right straight is also very dynamic, even able to catch opponents on the back foot, which he's done a few times in his career. Now, when it comes to the wrestling, them two trying to take each other to the ground, I find it pretty difficult. Both guys have good takedown defense. Oliveira welcomes the ground a lot more. He will pull guard, allow you to take him down, even if he knows he's up against a good grappler. Dariush's takedown defense against Gamrot is alarming for Oliveira. If Oliveira is still able to take him to the ground with that belly to belly he gets on everybody, that is going to be very impressive, because Dariush shut down Gamrot's takedowns like they were nothing. Honestly, the closer we get to the fight, the more I'm scared for Oliveira. But that's always the thing about his fights. You always think, Justin Gaethje or Michael Chandler or Dustin Poirier, like these guys are going to catch him. These guys have very dangerous hands. But he's finished all of those guys. It took a grappler in Islam Makhachev to change it up. Dariush by trade is also a grappler, but he's relying a lot more on his boxing. I think it's pretty simple how the fight is going to play out in terms of like what these two are going to try to do against each other. I think everything unfolds on Charles Oliveira's car crashes, on the exchanges that he creates. I think as Oliveira makes these exchanges, that's going to determine the winner of the fight and how the fight gets finished. I'm not going to make a prediction that's going to come out on Thursday, but this is definitely the biggest fight up until UFC 290. We're going to start with Jon Jordan. Have we already or will we reach a point where MMA is essentially its own martial art? Instead of training boxing, wrestling, BJJ, fighters will just train MMA. I can see how that could benefit fighters, as those styles must always adapt to MMA. So why not just train the quote-unquote MMA style, boxing, wrestling, etc.? Yes, I think it's already starting. In fact, some fighters actually just learned MMA. Even a long time ago, Roy McDonald had no background. He went right into MMA gyms and learned the whole thing together. So it's been going on, but it's not a widespread thing yet. Most gyms train boxing, wrestling, BJJ, and Muay Thai individually by themselves. And that is MMA. Those four martial arts are essentially the basics of MMA that everybody learns. Boxing, Muay Thai, wrestling with ground and pound, and fence takedowns with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's already started, but I do think it is absolutely going to be the future. And at that point, people could just look at MMA as its own thing. But there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be guys who are unique to MMA that bring karate styles or sambo styles or judo or something else that's not going to be traditional for MMA. And if you're someone who's pursuing MMA, learning just boxing and just wrestling and jiu-jitsu and stuff like that can actually hurt you, because you're going to learn things that are not going to work in MMA. You're going to learn things that only work in those specific sports. You're going to learn wrestling takedowns that are going to open you up for submissions that you don't have to really worry about in wrestling, but you do have to worry about them in MMA. So MMA wrestling is a whole different thing, just like MMA boxing, MMA Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, MMA Muay Thai. They're all very different from each other. If you practice Muay Thai, you can't be flat-footed in MMA, and Rodtang showed everybody that. When Rodtang fought Demetrius Johnson, his style completely changed in that round. He was moving around like a karate fighter because he had to. You can't just walk forward flat-footed in front of your opponent who's going to shoot takedowns. You got to move around and create distance, look for opportunities to intercept and counter. You can be flat-footed like that if you have insane takedown defense, but that's going to require wrestling. Like Jose Aldo, right? Jose Aldo was not a mover. He wasn't so elusive where he's constantly moving around. He used to march opponents down, destroy them with his Muay Thai and boxing, and defend all the takedowns, because he developed the greatest takedown defense in UFC history. So when that happens in the future, yes, fighters are going to be way better off, and you're going to see a different kind of evolution to the game where so many of the younger guys are going to understand the fundamentals of MMA better than ever before. It's still getting there. You do see a lot of younger guys who don't really have the basics necessarily all there. Their fundamentals are lacking a bit, which tells you of where the state is when it comes to learning MMA as a martial art. Then we go to Nate the Train. Bradley Martyn talked about how he would football tackle Devin Haney in a street fight. So how would a street fight against an MMA fighter similar size to Haney go, such as Petr Yan or even Yair Rodriguez? The fact that Bradley Martyn says that he's just gonna football tackle Devin Haney already tells you of how low his chances are of beating Devin Haney. He has no concept of footwork at all. You can't just football tackle a boxing world champion like Devin Haney. He's gonna be a matador. You're never going to get on him like that. You got to cut him off. You can't just chase him and just run at him. You're, number one, going to gas yourself out doing that. And number two, asking yourself to get knocked out. Now, if it was against Petr Yan or Yair Rodriguez, that means even more devastating. Petr Yan is definitely much smaller than Yair, so we'll look at him as an example. Yair would absolutely destroy Bradley Martyn. Petr Yan, it would be even worse, because this guy has amazing boxing skill, actually knows wrestling at a high level. Bradley Martyn would have no chance against Petr Yan or Yair Rodriguez. It would be exactly what Devin Haney would be able to do, but with guys who understand how to stop a takedown, understand how to get up from the bottom, understand how to submit Bradley Martyn, understand how to stall it out and gas him out. The chances of Bradley Martyn beating Petr Yan or Yair Rodriguez in a street fight is very, very low. And I'm glad, because even like Sean Strickland and Chris Curtis and these guys who are sparring every single day, they even admitted to this. They said Brendan Moreno, who's even smaller than all of these guys, would beat the NFL linebackers in a street fight. Those guys are extremely athletic, very big, fast for their size, and they would get beat up by Brandon Moreno, who's, 145 pounds maybe? It's something I've talked about for a long time. People who have never trained before just cannot grasp the extent of techniques and skill. It's very hard to understand if you're new to martial arts. I kind of explained it in that video as well. Like, people have been looking at size and strength for such a long time, for thousands of years, as the most capable fighter of the tribe, of the town, of the city, of the country. And back in the day, the only people that were learning martial arts were the soldiers that were fighting in war. And now, in like the last 200 years, which is still very new, the common people are learning martial arts. This is why the whole concept of skill has been so absent to the regular person, because for thousands of years, this was never even a concept. This was never something people thought about. People only thought about, oh, the biggest guy, he's the one. Then we go to who's house football. If you got to be the UFC matchmaker, how would you matchmake the top 15 of every division? You can cancel curtain fights or force fighters to accept fights if you want. And that's the kind of matchmaker I would be, like an absolute tyrant. So for the heavyweight division, I would put Blagoy Ivanov against Romanov. I would put Rosenstrike against Derek Lewis. I would put Marcin Tybura up against Sergey Spivak. Jalton Almeida against Tom Aspinall. Alexander Volkov against Tai Tuivasa. Curtis Blades against Stipe. I would put Curtis Blades against Cyril Gane. And Sergey Pavlovich against Jon Jones. It looks like Stipe just doesn't want to fight, so he could just sit out. For the light heavyweight division, I would put Dustin Jacoby against Ryan Spann. Jimmy Crute against Dominic Reyes. Khalil Rountree against Chris Dawkins. Azamat Murzakanov against Anthony Smith, Johnny Walker against Alexander Rakic, Nikita Krylov versus Magomed Ankalaev, Alex Pereira versus Jan Blachowicz. I do like that fight a lot. And Yuri Prohaska against Jamal Hill. I think I left out Volkan Oezdemir, but I honestly don't know who to match him up with. For the middleweight division, Andre Muniz against Paul Craig. That's an excellent grappling match. I think Chris Curtis versus Imavov is fine. Brendan Allen versus Bruno Silva I like still. Jack Hermanson versus Kelvin Gastelum. I would do Roman Dolidze versus Derek Brunson. Sean Strickland versus Dricus Duplessis. Paulo Costa versus Robert Whittaker. And Jared Cannonier versus Marvin Vittori. Wait out for Adesanya because he's already beat like all these guys. I would love to say Alex Pereira versus Adesanya, but Pereira wants to go up to 205, so. For the welterweight division, I would do Michel Pereira versus Michael Chiesa, Jack Della Maddalena versus Vicente Luque. That would be crazy. Ian Gary versus Stephen Thompson, Neil Magny versus Sean Brady, Jeff Neal versus Gilbert Burns. That would be crazy. Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Khamzat Chimaev, which is the best fight in all of the UFC. Bilal Muhammad versus Kamaru Usman, and Colby Covington versus Leon Edwards. For the lightweight division, I would do Grant Dawson versus Renato Moicano, Matt Favola versus Damir Ismagulov. I guess Dan Hooker and Jalen Turner, maybe. There's nothing else you could really do here for Dan Hooker, to be honest, and if we're going to have the funnest fight with him, it's probably against Jalen Turner. Both completely offensive fighters, no defense, two long, lanky guys just going at it. I would do RDA versus Armin Saryukian, Mateusz Gamrot versus Rafael Fiziev. That's a crazy fight. Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor, of course. Beneil Dariush versus Charles Oliveira, I would still keep that. Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje, I would still keep that. And for Islam, there really isn't a guy right now that stands out that I would like to see. I would like to see the winner of Oliveira and Dariush fight Islam before giving those guys an immediate shot against them. For the featherweight division, I would like to see Alex Caceres versus Edson Barboza. Two veterans, good strikers, great fight. Dan Ige versus Bryce Mitchell, Sadiq Youssef versus Mavsar Evloev, Ilia Topuria versus Josh Emmett, love that fight. Giga Shikadze versus Chan Sung Jung, where's Shikadze been, man? This guy hasn't fought in forever. Kelvin Kattar versus Brian Ortega, love that fight. Yair versus Volkanovski, of course. Now, with Max Holloway and Arnold Allen, these two guys already fought each other, and Max only gets a title shot if Yair beats Volkanovski and dominates him. Right, because if he just beats him, I think there will be an immediate rematch. If he dominates Volkanovski and makes it look easy, then I guess you could do Max versus Yair and Arnold Allen versus Alexander Volkanovski. But if Volkanovski beats Yair, I would still like to see the rematch with Yair and Max. I think that fight would be excellent, especially with Yair not coming off a big layoff and he's just performing much better than ever before. And in terms of Arnold Allen, I think him getting the winner of Ortega and Kattar makes more sense. Even though he did fight Kattar, it did end with an injury. He did kind of cause it in a way, but it also does seem a bit unfinished. For the bantamweight division, Jonathan Martinez versus Adrian Yanez is the fight you have to make. Chris Gutierrez versus Pedro Munoz, Ricky Simon versus Dominic Cruz, Umar Nurmagomedov versus Chito Vera, Song Yadong. I want to see the rematch with him and Corey Sandhagen because that fight was very close before the cut finished it. I love that fight too. That fight was super exciting. Rob Font versus Petr Yan, Henry Cejudo versus Merab Dvalishvili. I guess Sean O'Malley versus Aljamain Sterling. I would have had a different I originally had a different matchup for Sean O'Malley. I wanted him to fight Corey Sandhagen instead, but that would leave Aljamain Sterling out without an opponent, and nobody else makes sense. If I could have it my way and force them, I would actually have Merab fight Sterling, O'Malley fight Sandhagen, Cejudo fight Yan, and Rafon fight Song Yadong. For the flyweight division, I would have Bruno Silva versus Sumar Darji, Tagir Ulanbekov versus Tim Elliott, Muhammad Mokayev versus David Vorak, Manel Kape versus Matt Schnell, Alex Perez versus Matias Nicolau, Kai Kara-France versus Davison Figueiredo, if Davison is still going to fight at 125, again, I can't make him jump weight, Brandon Royval versus Amir Albazi, and Alexander Pantoja versus Brandon Moreno. For the women's bantamweight division, Chelsea Chandler versus Josiane Nunes, Norma Dumont versus Misha Tate, love that fight, Julia Avila versus Maria Silva, Carol Rosa versus Missy Kiasen, Penny Kianzad versus Yana Santos. I almost forgot that was Yana Kunitskaya. Irina Aldana versus Amanda Nunes. I like that fight. Caitlin Vieira versus Juliana Pena. And Holly Holm versus Raquel Pennington again. For the women's flyweight division, I like Miranda Maverick versus Tracy Cortez, Andrea Lee versus Casey O'Neill, Macy Barber versus Amanda Ribas. It's actually a fight I really like. Vivian Araújo versus Lauren Murphy. Jennifer Maia is in a strange position because she's pretty much fought everybody around her. Maybe just have the rematch with Caitlin Chukagian, because I don't want to throw them against the top 5, and there's nobody else that really makes sense for them. And honestly, their fights aren't the most exciting, so they could fight each other. Put them deep in the early prelims. Then we could do Erin Blanchfield versus Tala Santos, Jessica Andrade versus Mena Fiorot, and Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso again. And finally, for the strawweight division, I actually do like the Tabitha Ritchie and Jillian Robertson fight. I'll keep that. We'll do the rematch with Angela Hill and Michelle Watterson, Luana Pinheiro versus Marina Rodriguez, Tisha Torres versus Verna Yandroroba, Mackenzie Dern versus Carla Esparza, Amanda Lemos versus Rose Namajunas, and we'll do Yao Jianan versus Zhang Weili. Next question, we'll go to Voodoo Stones. How well do you think Vasiliy Lomachenko would do if he had transitioned MMA when he was in his prime, whenever you would determine that to be? We know he has a varied background in martial arts, growing up that included Sambo and Judo, as well as being a pound-for-pound boxing talent, not to mention all the unorthodox training methods his father has him do to keep mentally sharp. What division would he be in? And do you think he would be like a long-reigning champion or a champion at all? Love the videos and keep up the good work. Thank you so much, man. Vasiliy Lomachenko, if he went to MMA instead of boxing, but he kept all the skills from boxing, it's hard to judge that because we haven't seen to the extent of how good his wrestling actually is. But if he dedicated his time to take down defense and even taking down his opponents with submissions and all that stuff, he has a great style of footwork that would work very well in MMA. It would in general be a hard guy to shoot in on because you don't know the distance of where he's moving, and the sharp angles he's able to take like that is going to be very hard to deal with. I think the main problem he would have are with kicks, chopping down the legs, slowing down the movement and stuff. It's hard to say if he would be a champion, but I think he would be successful nonetheless. If he fought like in Bellator or the PFL, or one being more striking based, I think he could be a champion. In the UFC at 135 pounds, that's such a stacked weight class. It's such a hard thing to really gauge, not really knowing too much about a Sambo. We've seen him practice it a little bit, but in an actual fight's a whole different story. Then with the King Louis. Hey Weasel, how would you rank these MMA gyms in terms of coaches, elite fighters, and accomplishments / number of champions? Is this all time or right now? Because Jackson Wink all time is one of the top, but right now it's one of the bottom in this list. So what I'll say about Jackson Wink is 15 years ago, it was one of the top gyms in the world. It was probably the top gym in the world, to be honest here. I mean, they had so many good champions, and with that many good champions across the Western Hemisphere, they had to have had pretty good coaches to teach them that kind of stuff. They came up with really interesting techniques that they taught Jon Jones and GSP and Rashad Evans and all these other guys. Not too different of styles when you look at these fighters. I mean, a lot of them had good wrestling, but I would say Jackson Wink back in the day was the top gym. Right now, it's not that great. American Kickboxing Academy, aka I would say throughout its entire history has been a very, very solid gym. Like 5 to 7 years ago, it was probably the top gym. You had like 3 or 4 champions at the same time. You had Cain Velasquez, you had Daniel Cormier, you had Luke Rockhold, and Khabib. Now you have Islam Makhachev. Back in the day, you had pretty good fighters, but it didn't have too many champions. I would say American Kickboxing Academies, overall throughout its history, it's up there. Tiger Muay Thai, never really had that champion, but they do have a lot of contenders that train there. And what it seems like is a lot of the guys that do train at Tiger Muay Thai, they're not permanent. They're not guys that are always just there. There are some. I think like Rafael Fiziev is always there. I don't know if that's where Petr Yan holds his main training camp, but I would say it's pretty good with developing really good striking for MMA. American Top Team right now is the best gym. I would say like 3 years ago, it was definitely the top gym in the world. They have the most champions out of any super gym. And throughout its entire history, it's always developed very good fighters. Kill Cliff FC, Sanford MMA, Blackzilians, they've always had solid fighters. A couple champs here and there, but throughout its entire history, it's another high quality gym with high quality fighters and great coaches. Some of the coaches seem to be a bit outdated with what they do. If you notice about the fighters that are there, a lot of them have basic styles and don't get too much in the weeds of what Jackson Wink used to do with more unique techniques and stuff. Team Alpha Male, right now, not doing too hot. 10 to 20 years ago, it was like the essential gym for the lower weight classes until Dominic Cruz absolutely demolished those guys. City Kickboxing Academy right now is one of the top gyms. Of all time, I can't really say so because they never really developed a lot of champions throughout his history and stuff. But then again, they didn't have a lot of like Australian or New Zealand fighters in the UFC back then. So it's hard to gauge it of how it was before. But judging of when they actually had UFC fighters up until now, they've been high quality the whole time. Good coaches, good mindset. Their coach Behrman is excellent for the sport. So by looking at all of this, I would say American Top Team's number 1. I would say American Kickboxing Academy is number 2. I would say Black Zillions is number 3. City Kickboxing is number 4. Jackson Wink is number 5. Team Alpha Male, because of its history, is number 6. And then Tiger Muay Thai, because they haven't been around too long like that in MMA, and they haven't developed champions where all the others have. I would have to put Tiger Muay Thai right now at number 7. But its future is very bright. Your content has made me a more knowledgeable fan of the sport. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, man, and awesome question. And then we go to Oscar Bugless. How do you reckon Jack Della Maddalena does against the top 15 competitors? He for sure beats Michel Pereira. He beats Ian Gary. I think he gets it done against Michael Chiesa, but that's a tough one. He beats Neil Magny. Definitely beats Vicente Luque. The Sean Brady fight is almost 50-50. From this fight, we're going to know exactly where Jack Della Maddalena actually stands. I think he beats Jeff Neal, but that's a tough fight. I think he loses to Stephen Thompson. He could get it done against Shavkat, but the takedowns could be a big problem. I think he loses to Gilbert Burns, loses to Khamzat, loses to Bilal Muhammad, loses to Colby Covington, loses to Usman, and also loses to Leon Edwards. There's a lot of growing space for him. And then with the Mike Hansen. I love MMA, but is it fair to say that MMA athletes aren't as high level as athletes in other sports? I mean, arguably the best fighter is Volk, who started MMA at 23 years old and became the best. I know he wrestled when he was young, but he also gave it up when he was young at 14 years old and made his name as a striker anyways. The GOAT heavyweight in Stipe is a part-time firefighter, and Ngannou started at 26 and is one of the best of the sport. I know heavyweights rely more on power, but still. Yeah, I see what you're going with this, and it is pretty logical to think of it that way. These guys are not even taking it 100% seriously from the time they're little kids, and they're becoming the greatest. To measure athleticism is pretty difficult because all sports do it in a different way, so it is hard to compare who's the better athlete. I think the main reason why you see a lot of fighters not starting as young as like 10 years old and able to be a part-time firefighter and rely on power and stuff like that is for the fact that the sport is young. MMA started in 1993, whereas all these other sports, football, baseball, basketball, they've been around for like over 100 years. And every single one of those years, the sport keeps evolving. The athletes get smarter, new techniques get brought up, and it gets to a point where it's so fine-tuned that even the smallest of details can make the biggest differences in a game, in a match, whatever it is. And this also kind of ties in with the other question about when are we going to see MMA as its own style? Right now, a lot of guys are coming in from different sports. They're coming in from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or boxing or kickboxing or whatever. And they're transitioning to MMA when they're over 18 years old usually. That has become the tradition of MMA ever since it pretty much started, ultimately making it a completely different thing. I'm not too knowledgeable on the history of all these other sports, but I can imagine that sports like basketball and baseball, they weren't created as a mixture of different sports. They were kind of its own thing, right? MMA started as a mixture of different sports, which creates a lot of possibilities of what can happen in an actual fight, but also leaves many holes for fighters to exploit. This is why fighters are able to lose in many different ways and pick out different openings the majority of the fighters don't really see. And that's probably why you're able to see a guy like Volkanovski at 23 years old, able to get to a level where he's at. He does so many things right, and for a long time, for an example, he's one of the best guys when it comes to feints. He's able to mix up the game better than most fighters. He really started this sport as an MMA fighter. I wouldn't say that they're not as good of athletes. I think it's just a whole different thing. As the sport has been evolving, I mean, these guys have to learn all different kinds of martial arts. right? They gotta learn boxing, they gotta learn Muay Thai and wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and all this stuff. That is very difficult to do. I mean, would we say Islam Makhachev is not a good Sambo artist? He was a multiple-time gold medalist. And someone like Alexander Volkanovski was able to perform very well on the ground with the guy. It's not that, Volk starting the sport at 23 years old shows that these guys are not good athletes. It's just that Volk is special. He's going up against these kind of guys who've been doing this in different sports where that thing has been around for a long time, and he's attacking these guys in that discipline, in an MMA context, and doing well. Like if you were to think that a karate fighter would be one of the best wrestlers in MMA, you would think all those guys are just not good athletes. But then you mentioned that he out-wrestled multiple-time Division I All-Americans, and it's like, wait, what? It's just that karate guy, GSP, is a special talent. This guy's an insane athlete to be able to do that. I'll wrestle guys like Josh Koscheck and Johnny Hendricks. These are very credentialed collegiate wrestlers. Or Cain Velasquez stuffing Brock Lesnar's takedowns. What about Anthony Hernandez submitting Rodolfo Vieira? Rodolfo Vieira is a multiple-time world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, even won gold medal at ADCC. Or Andre Muniz submitting Jacare Souza. It's not fair to say that these guys are not good athletes. It's just a completely foreign landscape compared to other sports. It has so many different elements to it for the athletes in it to do different things in there. Whereas like for basketball, you're playing basketball. For baseball, you're playing baseball. There's really no other way to do it. There's some minor different details that can change up the game. But in MMA, not everybody's doing the same thing. Most guys actually are not doing the same thing. One guy can completely rely on his wrestling and grappling. One guy can completely rely on his striking. These guys are playing the game completely different from each other. Look at Israel Adesanya and look at Jailton Almeida. These guys don't even look like they're doing the same sport. So no, I wouldn't say that MMA fighters are worse athletes. Very good question though. Then we get to Deke Former. Yo Weasel, I have two questions. Number one, if Prime Jose Aldo fought Prime Alexander Volkanovski, how do you think that would go? And number two, with Jones likely retiring after the Stipe fight, who do you think will be the next champ? And do you think they will have a lengthy title reign? Thanks for the great content. Have a great day. You too, man. Thanks so much. Prime Jose Aldo versus Prime Alexander Volkanovski. I have to go with Volk. I think in the first two rounds, Aldo will give Volk a lot of problems, but Volk will put the pressure on him, keep a higher output, and force Aldo to work until exhaustion. Volk is going to be shooting takedowns on him, throwing his own leg kicks while trying to check, but I think Aldo's leg kicks will do some damage. The main thing about Volk beating Aldo are all on the feints. Aldo's the kind of fighter that reacts to everything you do. Feints and punches to all various degrees, he's going to react. So by Volk constantly feinting at him, it's going to overload Aldo's nervous system and cause him to just exhaust himself. By the time you get into the fourth and fifth rounds, I think Volk finishes Aldo. And if Jones retires after beating Stipe, I think the next champion is either going to be Sergey Pavlovich or Cyril Gane, and Jailton Almeida and Tom Aspinall are guys that can give him a run for their money. Those four are above the rest. There's nobody else on their level. And it's funny because those four are the youngest heavyweights, which shows you the evolution of the heavyweight division, how they have just surpassed the older guys. But who is the best out of them? I think they're going to exchange the title, which means that there's not going to be a lengthy title reign. I think Jailton Almeida and Tom Aspinall can beat Cyril Gane, but I think Cyril Gane could beat Sergey Pavlovich. But I think Sergey Pavlovich could beat Tom Aspinall and maybe Jailton Almeida. And Jailton Almeida and Tom Aspinall, I think it's almost an even fight. It's going to bounce back and forth between those fighters. It's going to depend on who becomes the more well-rounded guy. Does Cyril Gane develop the takedown defense? If he develops takedown defense, none of these guys are beating him. Now, if Jailton Almeida could develop good striking, then he has a chance to beat all these guys. It's going to depend on who progresses the best. Who progresses their skills the best and becomes a better, well-rounded fighter. But those four are definitely the top. I would like to bring up Curtis Blades, but man, he wrestles with wrestlers and he strikes with strikers. Then we go to TYZEHD. Jack Della Maddalena is fighting Sean Brady soon. How do you see that fight going, and do you think he makes it to a title shot or gets beat before that? Thank you for all the great content over the years. No problem, man, and thank you so much for the question. I'm high on this guy. Jack Della Maddalena so far has shown amazing skills to not only be a solid fighter overall, but I think he could be possibly top 5 very soon. The only thing is his takedown defense. That's why this fight with Sean Brady is so critical for his career. If he shows solid takedown defense against Sean Brady, this guy is going to skyrocket from his position in the rankings. He's going to be top 7 very, very soon, top 5. Then his takedown defense is going to be tested at a different level against the better wrestlers. Sean Brady's kind of the gatekeeper of like mid-tier wrestling. He's not the best wrestler, but he's not bad at it either. So if you could get by his wrestling, you're going to go up a few spots against guys who don't wrestle too much, like Wonder Boy, Jeff Neal, etc. Those guys are not going to shoot takedowns on you. And then you get to the Colby Covingtons and the Bilal Muhammads and Gilbert Burns, guys who shoot takedowns much better than Sean Brady. So it's tough to say. I gotta see his takedown defense. He did get taken down once by Ramazan Ameev, and he also defended one takedown there as well. So it's tough to say. Striking wise, this guy could strike with the best of them. I think Wonderboy, Leon Edwards are gonna give him a pretty tough tester. So far, I see a pretty even striking match between him and Jeff Neal. So do I think he makes it to a title shot? Just off my gut feeling, I'm going to say no. I think he gets beat before that and hangs around in the top 5, top 7 for the rest of his career. But I'm very much looking forward to see how his takedown defense progresses. Then we go to Austin. Hey Weasel, love listening to your podcast and watching your videos. Your insights made me an even bigger fan of MMA. That's awesome to hear, man. Thank you so much. So you asked about Gustafsson and Jon Jones, who really won. I did that video already. You could go check that out. And now your fantasy matchups. In their primes, who wins these fights? Jose Aldo versus Edson Barboza at lightweight. I'm going to have to go with Barboza. Aldo's a bit too small. He'll play Barboza's game. Most guys cannot beat Barboza in that kind of back and forth striking match from a distance. UFC 205 Conor McGregor versus UFC 257 Dustin Poirier. I'm going to have to go with Dustin Poirier. People have a misconception about Conor. It's something I mentioned before. He didn't get a whole lot worse if you actually pay attention to the skills that he's showing. He looks very similar to what he looked like before. It's just everybody else got so much better. I mean, we're talking about Conor not progressing since like 2016. It's been 7 years since this guy has gotten better. 7 years progression for Dustin Poirier looks like a whole different fighter. That's why Conor's getting beat. It's not because he's necessarily getting worse. He stayed the same, whereas everybody got exponentially better over the past 7 years. So because of that, I still have to go with Dustin for the same exact reason. I think the fight doesn't change too much. Khabib versus Michael Chandler in a 3-round fight. I would still go with Khabib. I think Khabib would get a 10-8 or something in that third round. Probably take the second as well. Michael Chandler would get a little too exhausted chasing Khabib around and wrestling with Khabib too. But I think Chandler would become like the third fighter to take a round from Khabib. Only in that first because of how explosive he is. He would give all he could though in that first round. After that, Khabib just dominates him. Alexander Volkanovski versus Colby Covington at welterweight. Colby 100%. He's way too big. Even though Colby doesn't cut a lot for welterweight, the guy's lean all the time. He's in fight shape all the time. When these welterweights get to 190 and 200, they're kind of out of shape. Colby's at like, what, 182? In shape, ready to go. He's 6 feet tall, he has a very good frame, and he's so used to fighting guys so much heavier. It's not even a problem for him. Imagine what Volkanovski's gonna feel like. This guy's wrestling with Kamaru Usman, taking down Jorge Masvidal, Tyron Woodley, guys who dwarf Volkanovski. And I understand the whole comparison to Islam, but Islam is a lightweight. Islam is not going to be as physically strong as Colby Covington is. The reason why people say Islam would beat Colby is only for the fact that he has submissions. And that's not even a given. Colby gives Islam problems as well. But the fact that Islam is so good with his submissions is the only reason as to why he could potentially beat Colby Covington. But with Colby getting so much better with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that outcome is losing itself as a reality. And not only that, Volkanovski has shown against Islam when he goes up against a good wrestler like that, he leaves openings in his defense when he's striking. And even Colby Covington could clip him here and there. Islam's not the biggest puncher in the world, and he was able to hurt Volkanovski a few times. Colby being bigger than Islam, yeah, he's not hurting a lot of people, but if he catches Volkanovski in those moments as well, he could potentially hurt him as well. If they were the same size, that would 100% give it to Volkanovski, but Colby's like way bigger than this guy. GSP versus Anderson Silva at middleweight in their prime. I always go back and forth between them two, but I would ultimately pick Anderson. GSP didn't have the best chin. It was hard to hit him clean, but when you did, you were able to hurt him, and nobody he ever fought hits like Anderson Silva, both with power and precision. And we're talking about prime Anderson Silva, who was the best sniper we've ever seen in UFC history. If anybody could find GSP's chin clean, it would be Anderson. And at middleweight to go with it, he would also be the bigger guy in the fight. Great submissions off his back. He would get taken to the ground, but there's so many openings for 5 rounds that Anderson will have to knock out GSP, and I think he would do it. Jose Aldo versus Islam Makhachev at lightweight. I would go with Islam for the fact that Jose Aldo would gas out. I mean, he has the best takedown defense in UFC history, but against a guy that much bigger than him and holding that up for 5 rounds, Jose Aldo would be exhausted. Islam would shoot him up against the fence and just wear him down, using his judo skills, everything to take down Jose Aldo. I think later in the fight, Islam will start to dominate it. Jon Jones versus Fedor at heavyweight. Have to go with Jon Jones, 100%. Fedor would be Jon Jones' most dangerous matchup ever for the fact that he has solid takedown defense, good base in the clinch, and one-punch knockout power, but I think Jon Jones is just too much. He'll be kicking at his knees, something Fedor has never seen before, jabbing him from across the cage, hitting with knees and elbows in the clinch, spinning back elbows off the takedown attempts. Fedor would be completely out of his element against Jon Jones, in my opinion. But they fought in completely different eras, so it's not really fair. Max Holloway versus Nate Diaz at lightweight. Both in their prime, I would actually go with Nate Diaz. The Nate Diaz that fought Michael Johnson is going to be a very hard guy to handle. Neither guy are going to get knocked out. They're both zombies. Neither guy are going to gas out. But I think Nate Diaz's volume is never going to allow Max to get going. He's much bigger than Max in every metric. He's like 6'1". Max is 5'11". He's going to have like a 7-inch reach advantage. Imagine all the jabs from that distance on Max. Max has to get his way in, which is something he's not used to doing. He's usually the guy that's fighting at distance or just like a neutral. He's never really the guy that has to get in on you. And not only that, if Nate takes Max to the ground, Max is going to be in some trouble. The volume from Nate Diaz's boxing, I think would be the main reason as to why Max would not look like himself in that fight. He would never be able to get out of first gear. Conor McGregor versus Yair Rodriguez at featherweight. I'll go with Conor. There's always a possibility Yair knocks him out with a head kick, but Conor has such good movement, so aware at distance, and I don't think Yair is going to be ready for that boxing. He's so open on the center when he's exchanging with you. I don't think Conor knocks him out, but Conor would definitely ding him many times with the left, winning on the scorecards. And Conor at featherweight definitely had better cardio. When he put on that weight on himself, he didn't show the same kind of cardio he did when he fought like Max Holloway. When he went 3 rounds with Max Holloway, he wasn't even breathing at all, and he was fighting with one leg in that 3rd round. If he starts to gas out against Yair, then yes, I would actually pick Yair to win by a late knockout. But in general, I'll go with Conor. Thank you for being such an amazing content creator, and credit to the MMA community. Thank you so much, man. Next question, we'll go to Pluto Rambo. Weasel, could you compare Ikram Aliskerov to the top 5 middleweights? Just watched your Khamzat vs. Ikram breakdown. Love your content, bro. Thank you so much, man. Yeah, I've been talking about this guy. Even though he lost to Khamzat and he got knocked out, in that short fight, he showed many skills that he's very much capable of being the ranked fighters of the middleweight division. And knocking out Phil Haas the way he did was spectacular. So Ikram versus Paulo Costa. I think this is actually one of his tougher fights because Costa has good takedown defense. He can be pretty difficult to deal with on the feet, but he does leave himself open. He doesn't have the best chin either. I mean, the fact that Luke Rockhold was able to catch him the way he did, it will make a lot of people very worrisome for Paulo Costa's chances of not getting clipped by Ikram. Ikram will definitely shoot him for takedowns to mix it up too, and Paulo Costa is so inactive, he's definitely going to be rusty yet again. So right now, I'd honestly say Ikram has a very good chance of beating Paulo Costa, but I would say 55-45 for Ikram. I think he beats Jared Cannonier through the wrestling. People are going to judge Ikram off that knockout win that he's some kind of striker. But no, the guy's a Sambo fighter. He's a Sambo world champion. That's his background. That's what he does the best. But his UFC debut has shown that his striking is nothing to laugh at either. So yes, I do think he beats Jared Cannonier. I think he outstrikes Marvin Vettori. The wrestling would kind of even itself out, making it a stand-up fight, and Vettori just doesn't have that clean-up striking. I think he runs into a brick wall when he fights Robert Whittaker. Whittaker stops all the takedowns and completely outstrikes him. Alex Pereira is technically in the top 5, so I think he beats Pereira with the wrestling. And against Adesanya, right now, I'll go with Adesanya because most of Ikram's takedowns are going to be against the fence, and that's where Adesanya's takedown defense is at its best. But in the future, if he progresses and just keeps racking up wins here, I think he has a good style on paper to beat Adesanya. Now, I want to get into more of the YouTube video comments that I asked because I did ask you guys, and it wouldn't be fair if I just didn't read a couple of them. So if you guys want to ask questions, not only am I going to do the community posts, but even on the video itself, I'm going to leave a pinned comment and you guys can reply your questions there as well, if that's just easier for you. I'm only going to go through 2 of them. So the first one is going to be Trouble on the Waters. Who's your favorite female fighter currently and ever? Also, what do you think is next for Rose? Of course. I thought it was great that someone finally called her out after all this time. Yeah, my favorite female fighter ever is definitely Rose, for the fact that she comes from a very similar background that I do, and I like her techniques. I love her footwork, all that stuff, and she's one of the female fighters that shows great skill even compared to the men. She finishes fights, she has like the most knockdowns in strawweight history, powerful fighter, very technical, all of it together. And Rose with hair, still to this day, is the GOAT. If she comes back and fights, I think the Amanda Lemos fight or Yang Jiaonan are the perfect matchups for her. Never have her fight Carla ever again. And then we finally go to R. Nason. How many years do you think Politan has left in the UFC? I think no more than 3 years. He's trying to do big things and retire. It possibly, I'm not going to lie, it could possibly be 1 or 2 years. If he loses to Jan Blachowicz, he might even retire next year, and I wouldn't be shocked. And that's the end of the episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to give this a like, make sure to subscribe. The prediction video is going to come out on Thursday, and I might have a pre-breakdown of the Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush fight, so be on the lookout for that, and I'll see you guys then.